So as to the matter at hand, so today, it's been a while, I think, since we've done a series of what we call the Mind That Seeks the Way talks. Okay. How many people have been here for past ones that members of GIVE? Yeah, so we invite members to share their journey, but let me just explain before I invite Misti up, so in the Buddhist tradition, there is this mind that seeks the way, right? This is the mind that seeks the way of awakening, the mind that seeks the way of freedom from suffering, freedom from delusion, freedom from affliction, seeks the way, that way, as opposed to the way that many of us have traveled in this life, which is, there are all kinds of ways that don't lead to any really beneficial place that we've spent a lot of energy following. So the mind that seeks the way is this, traditionally when one enters formally, the Buddhist way, or any spiritual way in a formal way. But what we do in these talks is ask members, and I think that's what makes these talks so interesting, is that perhaps long before, even back in our childhood, that mind that seeks the way, that knows there's another way to live, another way to be, right? Even though it might not have been talked about at our, dining room table in the evening with our families or in school, but somehow, whatever was going on, there's always been something else inside us, right? And that can be very conscious, can be very unconscious, can be very present, can be very distant, can come and go. But eventually, when one enters a spiritual path, it now has a home. It now has a name. And it now has the capability of flowering. So I've invited Misti, Oxford-Pickeral from Gainesville, a member from Gainesville. Misti's been a member here for 8 years. She grew up in Texas, ended up in Florida, so what can we say? She currently lives in Gainesville with her family. She's a wife, she's a mother of 3 adult children. She's an acupuncturist, a teacher. She originally trained as a molecular biologist and worked in research and development, but then in the 90s changed careers after an exposure to acupuncture, and she's now director of clinics, faculty member, and clinical supervisor at an acupuncture college in Gainesville. Again, she's been a member here since 2016. She's ordained in the Order of Interbeing, and even though she lives in Gainesville, she comes down here a lot, involved in Sangha care. She often, I think in this coming retreat, she volunteers to work in the kitchen, supporting retreatants, as well as she on the board of directors and will be our incoming president for next year. So, Misti? Mr.
Good morning. So lovely to be here with you all today. Happy to be here, and thank you to our teacher Fred for asking me to share about my journey, how how I came to study the Dharma, and really fundamentally how that has helped me to heal and transform. It is my sincere wish that this sharing is helpful in some way, maybe strikes a chord, and ultimately helps to bring benefit to others of you out there listening. So, as Brad mentioned, I grew up in the high desert plains of West Texas in a few little farming communities near the border with New Mexico. My family was involved with cotton farming and then the processing of that, which, for those of you who may or may not be familiar, is cotton ginning and cottonseed delinting. I grew up in the country. I'm the middle child of 3. I have an older brother and a younger sister. And so I want to talk about some factors that I think really helped shape my young life. In my early years, we moved frequently, mostly for my dad's work, his looking for various opportunities to help our family. And so what that translated into is that I grew up in a situation of somewhat of poverty. And definitely there were periods, in fact, pretty important periods of neglect that ended up also being punctuated with some anger and violence. And, ultimately my parents weren't really present. When they weren't terrifically involved. Just to set the scene a little bit, my mom in particular was not very emotionally stable. And my dad traveled a lot for work and was at work a lot. In fact, took, I think, work as his refuge, retreated into that. And having one parent not very present and another parent not very stable had a really big impact on the environment in which we grew up. Also adding to that, my dad had several injuries that involved surgeries, and then the medical bills that kind of came with that added to that, sense of not really having enough to make ends meet. And those things further then triggered my mom's instability, right? So not having somebody there to help provide, so her instability was pretty pronounced. My older brother suffered quite a lot. I'm still not 100% sure of his causes, all of his previous causes and conditions before I came around, but he also was very angry, and his anger would result in kind of violent outbursts. He turned to drugs in his teens and has had a pretty troubled life even into adulthood. And my younger sister and I were often on the receiving end of my brother's violence and his anger. So generally speaking, just a lot of suffering in the household. I think it was pretty much par for the course for my parents growing up when they did and how they did, that I think you probably heard the adage, spare the rod, spoil the child, right? That was definitely where my parents came from. And so when they were involved, it was mostly to step in and punish, and so that's, a lot of the memories that I carry from childhood were around that. And with a mom that didn't have a lot of good skills and was suffering herself, her common tools in her tool belt were using humiliation, belittling, expressing disappointment. That was, really common. So for me, what I did with that information is I internalized a message that there was really something wrong, and wrong with me, right? That I, needed to be being very different than I am. I also, to kind of, look for the silver linings in some of this, I learned to read people really quickly, right? You learn to read somebody's moods and, sort of what's the situation in the room. Unfortunately, that also results sometimes in learning how to walk on eggshells. In my household, vulnerability was a liability. And so it wasn't really safe to express anything, as you've probably heard, anything you say can and will be used against you. So that definitely was the case. So, so I think fundamentally having a dad who wasn't around much for work purposes, and also probably his own protective mechanism, and having a mom that was a little bit unstable made it so that I didn't feel like home was a very safe place for me. The rules of the game seemed to change without warning. And then, the adults in the room, the adults in my life weren't really paying attention, right? My brother and my sister were sort of going off the rails. But even in the midst of all of this, there were good times, and so, nothing is ever always one way. And also, one of the things I'm gonna, hopefully talk a little bit about today is these moments of clarity or glimpses, as Fred said, of another way of being. And so, sort of using a really horrific example, there was one particular incident really early on. I was probably, I'm gonna guess, around 8 years old. An incident of violence between my mom and my brother, pretty shocking, that really stood out, like a moment of distinction. It was almost like time stood still for a moment. I can remember it so vividly. And I remember seeing this happen and knowing I had to go get my dad and saying, I will never lose it like this. I will never do this to my kids. If I have the opportunity to grow up and have kids, it's never going to be like that. Like 8 years old, I don't know why. I feel very fortunate that those moments could stand out in a way where I could say, there has got to be another way to do this, So, it's like realizing you have a choice when you didn't even realize there was a choice to be made. So I'm very grateful for those. So also, not surprisingly, I picked up a lot of the habits and the behaviors of my family of origin. I was often very angry, angry with my brother, angry with my parents for not being there. I was often really scared. I felt like I had to be constantly on the alert and defending myself. Other times were easier. I remember some visits to my cousin who lived in Houston. He was sort of we were of the same age. We were kind of best buddies. We would hang out together. And going to Houston and being in his environment and seeing his life, I really saw another way. I saw his mom and his dad and how they were with him, but also not just with him, but with me when I was there. Again, this aha moment that these people really care. There wasn't any yelling. There were no angry words. There was no humiliation, no slaps and pinches, and no violence, right? It was just peaceful. Life was good. These people were stable. They were kind to each other. They played music together. My uncle was really fabulous on the banjo, and my cousin played the cello, and he would take us swimming in the evenings after work. Whoa, it felt a little bit like a fairy tale, to be honest, But it was another way, right? Oh wow, this is how one could be with their kids and interact and have relationship. It was also a pretty important beginning for me too, because that's when I first started to be sort of called out for the bad behaviors that I had learned and internalized, and kind of realizing that people I cared a lot about didn't really respond very well to that way of being, So to be called out on language or behavior, unfortunately at the time I did sort of use that to water some not so wholesome seeds in myself. Again, that, wow, there's something fundamentally wrong with you kind of seeds, But it was also useful, and I'll come back to that usefulness in just a minute. Like I mentioned, strangely, this situation had its really good aspects along with those not so good aspects. My siblings and I sort of raised ourselves and each other, I guess you could say. That was the not so good part. But we were also left alone to do what we wanted, which for me ended up being a really good thing. I didn't have a lot of outside influence in my, in the decisions. I wasn't told to be a way or do a thing or, believe a certain thing. And so when I was on my own, generally speaking, I was a pretty happy kid. I loved being in nature, especially with my dog. We lived out in the country, so we would go out exploring, and being on my own outside was a sanctuary. It was such a wonderful place of retreat. Also, I found school and education. I was good at it. I was a curious kid. I was interested, and my interest and my curiosity drew some attention, some positive attention from my teachers. I also found music and singing at that time through school, was engaged in choir. And it was particularly interesting because my family isn't and wasn't, still isn't particularly educationally oriented, right? So having this thing that I was good at, where I was getting positive reinforcement, really helped to set me apart, right? So it gave me something to reach for. And I have so much gratitude for a couple of teachers in particular for seeing something in me and reaching out with support and encouragement. So that was another one of those moments of clarity, right? Education could be a way out. I could create a better life for myself based on these things that I already possessed. I was very interested in math and science, which was a little unusual for where I grew up, what was expected of young ladies in West Texas, but I excelled. I'll give a shout out to both my 7th and 8th grade science teachers who really inspired in me a love of the natural world. They showed me a worldview that I hadn't seen before, which then ultimately helped to expand my own, see beyond my own. And then in high school, I became familiarized with, introduced to Eastern thought through literature, actually, through my English teacher. We read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And we also read the Upanishads, which is, kind of strangely to me, mind-blowing that was what was happening in Lubbock, Texas. But I'm very grateful that really captivated me, right? That thought really captivated me and opened my mind. So that was, really pivotal. So, Sarah Duncan, wherever you are, thank you so much. And still, so there's this kind of give and take, the push and pull. The people that I loved, my, dear friends that I wanted to be around, continue to kind of, react negatively or react poorly to my behavior. I was super reactionary. I was so angry. I was loud. I used cutting language, and I was really judgmental. All things that I, learned and witnessed and saw in my world. And on some level, I'm really, really grateful that I could see their negative reaction to my behavior, because it led me to go, okay, wait, I want to be loved. I want to be liked. I want to have friends. I want to be good. I want to be better. But I didn't really have any tools to do that. So I just said, shove it down, suppress it. Any of those negative remarks, they just don't leave your lips. So in a way, the be a log was already working for me early on, but I was using the whip internally, right? I was beating it down in myself. I had internalized that humiliation and disappointment. So anytime those thoughts would come up, I would recognize them, but I would use them to not be very kind to myself. Outwardly, it looked good. Looked like I had it together. I was doing well. I was succeeding in school. I got into college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. So, things looked on the outside like they were going really well. Also, by this time in my family, I was desperate to break free. I was ready for something else. My brother was unfortunately increasingly violent, increasingly into drugs, had gone to jail. My sister was suffering with mental health issues, had also gotten into drugs. My parents were unhappy. They were struggling financially. My dad's health and surgeries and medical bills, my sister's mental health and medical bills. And, so college to me looked like ultimate freedom, right? I wanted to get out of that situation. I was so afraid that I was going to end up like my siblings, right? That I was going to be on drugs and I was going to be unhappy and mentally unstable in my life. And I'd already seen that there could be another way. And so, I feel like I was running away from something while I was also running towards something else. In college, I got to read some Dharma books, which was, another great thing, having, kind of pulling forward what I learned in high school. I was introduced to Pema Chodron, to the Dalai Lama, to Thich Nhat Hanh. In college, I also got to meet new, interesting, different people that weren't like my family of origin. I met my wonderful future husband, who is now my husband. He was so different from anybody that I had met, right? He wasn't from West Texas, and so had a whole different outlook on life, which also helped to open my awareness to there being another way. We kind of have a joke where I grew up that if you want to leave Texas, you first have to springboard through Austin, right? It's like the gateway to the rest of the world. So I moved to Austin for work. I had studied molecular biology, and so I had worked at the Texas Tech Health Sciences Center in research and development. And then I got a job at this wonderful little biotech firm in Austin, Texas. And Austin is really like a whole other world, especially if you grew up in little farming communities in West Texas. I did yoga, I did meditation, I started listening to Dharma talks on these things you might have heard of. They're called cassettes. You remember that? Yeah. So on cassette tapes, but also eventually courses on CDs, etc. It's also where I learned about acupuncture and had my first acupuncture visits and was kind of bitten by that bug. Interestingly, when I started studying acupuncture, I started studying that in Austin as well, I learned about this sort of patron saint of acupuncture, they would say, the one who hears the cries of the suffering. And Kuan Yin is the name of that particular one in Chinese medicine, and I learned that is just another name for Avalokiteshvara. So that little connection to Dharma was made in the work that I was pursuing and in the practices that I was so interested in. And so I really fell in love with the Dharma, even my superficial understanding of it, but I still didn't have a teacher. I didn't have a Sangha. I didn't even really have tools to implement the teachings on a very deep level, right? The CDs are great, and they'll kind of walk you through a few things, but there's nobody there to talk to about it, and there's nobody there to take guidance from. And so it was good. It was a great start and very useful, but ultimately, I needed more than that. Fast forward a little ways, my husband actually discovered Florida Community of Mindfulness for us and really gifted my family a membership because he wanted to support my going on retreat. That was a big goal of mine, is to take a retreat. And so having gotten involved with Florida Community of Mindfulness, I was able to, I've done many intensives, I've done many retreats, and being involved and having a teacher and having a Sangha has really led to my emotional healing, right? It helped me to deal with the anger that I had suppressed, that I was, the hiding and stuffing of emotions, right? It introduced me to a teacher, a wonderful teacher who can see clearly where you're stuck and where you're ready to grow. And also wonderful mentors, people who've been here before, who've done this before, to kind of guide us forward. I've met so many wonderful Sangha friends. I've engaged in Dharma study. And so, now I get to say, here I am now. I feel like I'm a better wife, a better mother, a better friend, a better coworker, and really ultimately a better human being. So I'm really grateful for all those little glimpses of a different way of being. I'm grateful for the ability to see them, to understand their significance, and, in some not so skillful ways, to do something with them. So there are, just a couple of other anecdotes that I feel like would be useful to know about. So my father passed away when he was quite young. It's unusual to say I've now outlived my father. I'm older than my father ever got to be. And that loss was really fundamental. I was, sharing with my husband that I feel like the difficulty in our family was because he wasn't able to be with the suffering of those around him. And so he would retreat, and he had, illness, pretty serious illness, obviously, that led to his early death. But I feel like what that meant, as I've said before, there was no sort of checks and balances for my mom, who had this instability. So his suffering compounding her suffering. So the relationships began to change when my father passed away, right? So when I moved to Austin in Texas, still in Texas, only several hours away, my mom basically stopped communicating with me. That was a breach. That was, some things that one didn't do was move away. And so she took it very personally, and for a long time we didn't have a relationship. She couldn't understand why I would want to leave, and which was really interesting. And then, as my father was getting ill and we were spending more time going back to see him, I saw her begin to soften as well, and we began to become better in relationship. My mom is still my mom. She still has her causes and conditions. And yet, any of those changes, like the loss of somebody, like to be able to be there regardless of my suffering, like there's a way I could have just completely turned away. And I thought about it, right? I thought about just completely estranging myself because it's too painful to look at that and say, oh, I even still today feel like I'm somewhat running away from the possibility of what could be there. It's a little too close. And so that's a big place in my practice. But instead, to have enough tools, to have enough awareness to turn back to this person who is suffering, who has had a tremendous loss, who was already struggling, and to be there for her, I think that really began to change things for me. It has continued, because one of the many ways that practicing the Dharma has benefited me, and hopefully will benefit my children as well, is, and this took a lot, was to realize that my parents did the best they could, right? Because if they could have done better, they would have done better. They weren't evil people. They were products of their causes and conditions. And so being able to practice with my parents, maybe not directly with them, sitting with me, but to sit with them when they were children, to imagine their life and their upbringing. My dad was one of 14 children. They were born into poverty, deep poverty. There was never enough to eat. There wasn't, so he was, I sort of jokingly describe him sort of like Pa Ingalls from, the Laura Ingalls Wilder, like everybody, he was really beloved. The kids loved him, but if you think about it from the mom's perspective, like he was constantly chasing the next great thing, right? This is going to be what saves us. This is going to be what gets us out of this. My dad was a little bit like that, right? This next opportunity, this next job, this next thing. And so we moved around a lot. And so, knowing where that came from in him was really fundamental for me to take a step back from my own suffering, to take a step back from the fear that I had, and to say, what would lead somebody to, smoke cigarettes and eat the way he did that contributed to, his early death. Like, oh, this like early life of not ever having enough. I remember having a conversation with him in the hospital, I think maybe after his first heart attack, or maybe, I don't remember if it was after the second heart attack, but, saying, Dad, we, please, for your grandkids, please stop smoking or stop eating chicken fried steak and cream gravy, or, just do something a little bit differently. And he kindly but firmly said, I made a decision a long time ago that, I'm going to do what I want to do because I didn't have the opportunity. Now that basically I have more than 2 nickels to rub together, I'm going to live the way I want to live. And being in my 20s, that felt like an affront. That felt like, oh, you're choosing chicken fried steak over your family? But ultimately what he was choosing was freedom in his own kind of warped way. So, I feel like that I got to transform my own suffering in regard to him and to understand him more clearly. And the same thing is true with my mom, rather painfully. Well, in full disclosure, my mom lives with us. My mom has dementia, and she's actually lived with us for, I think, about 10 years now. And in so many ways, she is a very, very important teacher for my practice. My household ends up being a little bit of a laboratory, because first of all, there's the part of living with someone with dementia that's difficult, right? But then there's also the added layer of all the things from the past, all the ways of being, and to recognize this person in front of me now isn't the same person that was there reacting and having tantrums and throwing things, and that isn't the same person now, even though the seeds were there. And so working with her, sitting with her, my kids and my husband and I have had many conversations about the fact that my mom was unable to transform the suffering, the kind of intergenerational suffering that she experienced. The way she knew to be in the world and to treat people was the way she was treated. And, her family was pretty dysfunctional. She had a lot of favoritism that was unevenly applied to the kids in her family. Her father was not reliable, so a lot of kind of repeating themes. And so instead of having any tools or maybe even having the circumstances to recognize and transform that, she perpetuated that into the next generation. So there was favoritism in our upbringing. My sister was sort of the golden child, or at least identified as the one, when somebody is unstable, it's not like it's all fun and games, right? Like, she could be a fierce protector, but also your worst enemy. So I'm not saying my sister had it easy either. But that watching that unfold and having her in our house, those patterns are still there. I have a little bit more agency over them now, and especially with patience and understanding and kindness and compassion, I can respond to them differently, but they're all still there. And, my children have been affected by this, and, my husband and I have been affected by this too. So again, this is an ongoing thing, like this, working with my parents to understand, to have compassion, and then to truly decide to not do it the same way, to be the end of that suffering, to hopefully transform that intergenerational suffering into something else. So the path has really helped me so much grow and heal and transform. And so I'll just say a little bit about the threefold path here at FCM. Super, super effective for me. First, starting with the basic building blocks of establishing mindfulness, healing emotional afflictions, right? Learning how to be with my anger, how to take care of it, how to transform it, I feel like, it may have saved my life, but it definitely, I feel like, helped save the lives of others, or at least helped to save the relationship that I had with others. How to be with my fear, how to take care of that. I'm very much looking forward to this next retreat, because, even with practice, even with years of practice, these things still come up in me, and I still have to go take care of them. Learning how to be compassionate with myself. As I mentioned before, vulnerability was a liability, right? And that if I was seen to be weak, that was a place, especially my brother would really kind of hone in on that and use it to hurt. And, also the same with some of the adults in my life too. So it just wasn't safe to be vulnerable. And learning how and why someone might open their heart has been really, really revolutionary for me, right? For reasons I can't explain, I came in from the time I can remember wanting to help people. If people asked my family, how people do with little kids, hey, little girl, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would always say I want to be a doctor. Nobody in my family was a doctor, but I knew, just from, I don't know where, if I, just happened to come in with that, but I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to help people. I wanted to be of service to people. And that was what, again, being interested in the sciences and studying molecular biology was to, at some point, go hopefully into medicine. And then I had a few interactions with Western medicine that soured my desire to want to become a doctor. So I was like, okay, that's not it. So I went into research and development. And then in the midst of being a scientist in a lab, one of my coworkers suggested that I go see her acupuncturist. And for me, that was totally out of left field, not at all in my Western science brain. But what I've grown to understand is that desire, that I guess I'll call it an aspiration to be a doctor from, the time before I can remember, has led me now to be an acupuncturist, where I get to help people transform their suffering. I get to help alleviate suffering in those ways. And so, there are moments that I feel like we're presented with, I know I was presented with, that even in the midst of a difficult situation where I felt like something was shining a light. And I'm so happy that I could continue with some of those and, use them to sort of heal and to transform and to be in the world in a way that feels in alignment with my current aspiration. So anyway, the learning how to open one's heart, for me, learning how to open my heart, how to be vulnerable, super important. And then also letting go of reactivity. That's been, I think, one of the most useful tools for living with the person who was a cause of so much suffering in my early life, is to just be able to let go of reactivity, to generate peace and ease and equanimity inside myself, allows me to be the stable one in the boat. My mom is still not in a stable place. It's not going to get better, right? So to just be with that and to know that and to say, okay, how can I help her, right? How can I heal this, going all the way back? How can I be available for her? So then after this first level of the path of establishing mindfulness and healing emotional afflictions, then being able to study the Dharma and understand it and have people help me translate it into everyday terms that make sense. So important. I talk about I use the phrase "be like a log." That's from one of the teachings. When you are confronted with something and these things are arising, you just say nothing. Like I said, I employed that early on before I knew what it was, but now, instead of just remaining like a log, now I can use these tools to deal with that stuff. So, studying the Dharma and having it interpreted for our modern times has also been super valuable for me. And then taking the intensives, working with that material and with teachers and mentors to then kind of get me ready for the Dharma path, right? Wisdom and compassion. Dedicating my life to liberation for myself and for the alleviation of suffering and ultimately the liberation of others. I just don't think that there's anything better I could be doing with my life. I feel very lucky that my career seems to intersect nicely with practicing the Dharma as well. So not only for myself, but for those people that I grew up with that were suffering so much, practicing for my siblings, practicing for my brother, for my sister, practicing for their children, some of whom they don't have relationships. My brother's estranged from his kids. One of my sister's children is a ward of the state of Texas. It's like it's so close and yet really so far away from where I am. And I would say, thanks to these moments of clarity and thanks to the Dharma and practicing the Dharma. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening. I hope this has been helpful and hopefully inspires you to practice. My experience is that when I practice, transformation happens.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so that was wonderful, very lucid and clear. You're a very good presenter. I don't
Thank
think
you.
I've ever heard you present before. Quite wonderful. Yeah, the mind that seeks the way, you know what I mean? And for some people who have it easier in life or had more positive influences, clearly, it's not as, its presence is not so clear, or defined or stands out in relief. But when somebody has a background like you had, where you look back and go, wow, there was nothing in that family to nurture, seeds of compassion and seeds of love and seeds of wanting to not suffer, when you're in an environment where that's normal. So this mind that seeks the way, even though now you talk about Dharma and liberation, it was there then, wasn't it? There was something inside you that wasn't in any of the others that you didn't get from your genetic pool, from your hereditary pool, from your, the causes and conditions of your life. When you talk about your brother and your sister, you see, that's where the causes and conditions were pushing you, right?
Right.
Yeah, and to see, where did that come from? We have all kinds of things about resiliency. There's all kinds of, but it's from a Dharma point of view, it's much deeper than that. Like you said, to have that awareness when there was nothing in your environment to attune you to that there is another way. Or when you see it, like when you talked about your cousin, when you saw it. I mean, it was like, there is another way. I would imagine your brother and sister might have also been exposed to that family.
Yeah.
But they didn't see it.
No.
Or they didn't see their possibility. Right? But you did, you see, and again, I'm not saying like you did, but it's like, yeah, there was something else operating inside me that like, oh, as soon as you saw it, you knew, right? With a lot of surety, wow, there is another way. And that's the mind that seeks the way. And then you say, is it just, like you say, you read the Upanishads, which are these Hindu texts in high school. I mean, how many kids in that class went, oh, wow, that's really wonderful.
Right.
What? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, not very many.
Not many in West Texas. So, but you go, oh, you see where'd that come from? Right? And that's when you begin, for all of us, to see there has been something else operating in my life. When I was young, very unconscious. That might not have been present all the time. Like you said, there was a lot of, in your own self, anger and fear and repression. And, so it wasn't like it was there all the time.
Right.
It was like it would surface, but just it would surface at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And that. Yeah, so, I'm sure many of us here in the hall and online listening to your talk there might have been many moments where, go, ooh, I know that one, right? So let's open it up. Questions? Questions for Misti? Anything you want more explanation or to take a little deeper? People in the hall, just put up your hands, and then people online, just chat it in to Dee Dee.
So Tammy.
Misti, thank you very much for sharing your story. I can't imagine sitting there and sharing mine, and I just feel so much like pride that you can do that. That's beautiful. I heard you mention the books from high school, and I like to journal. I really want to write those down so I can check them out, and I couldn't catch it, and I was wondering if you could repeat them a little slower.
Sure. So the two that I read in high school, one of them was Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and the other one is the Upanishads. Upanishads, it's a Hindu text. Yeah, we can write it out after. Yeah. Thank you. It is kind of an interestingly vulnerable thing to, sort of open up and say, this is what happened. And talking to my dear friend Danny, it's like this is what happened, right? This is, from my perspective, what happened. And it's not so much to turn it into a soap opera as much as it is to say, there's a way out, there's something I can do about that. And, so yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Judy.
Monica noted that Buddhism and acupuncture were both originated in Asia a long time ago, and she's wondering how they're related.
Well, goodness, that's a really long story, I think. I think that concept of, it's an entirely different paradigm of thought to approach, medicine, like, acupuncture from this standpoint, but there are a lot of similarities about personal cultivation. Like, that's a big part of what we do in the school where I teach acupuncture, and I am the director of clinics, is like, who you are is who you are. And so you must work on that to be a vehicle for healing and transformation for other people. So this idea that, we are all part of the same, in Chinese medicine, it's based in nature. In Buddhism, there's obviously a very strong connection to nature. Taoism plays a role in both things. The Taoism, Buddhism and Taoism are related. Taoism and Chinese medicine are intimately related. So, there's just a lot of overlap. Whatever was happening in terms of thought and personal and cultural and community development, I think influenced both things.
Briefly, is Misti your given name?
It is.
It is.
I get that a lot, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that's influenced your path at all?
Oh, interesting. Well, so a couple of funny stories. So yes, my given name is Misti, and if you were to look at those baby name charts, like over time, like 1971, whoop, Misti. You know why? There is a movie that had a very popular song called Play Misti for Me. So that is why I believe my name is Misti. And I also, I grew up in a time frame in the early 70s where a lot of girls had names that ended in I. right? There were the Tiffanys and the Britneys and the Misties and the Brandys and the, whatever. And so there were just a lot of us like that. And it is interesting how often I get that question, like, what do you think it's short for? Is it kind of, the question that I ask back, but instead of it being given, was it something I adopted? And no, and I do think, for better and for worse, I think it helped to shape me, right? Because it's a name that could be interpreted as, frivolous, right? And so I wanted to be anything but frivolous. And at the same time, Misti, it's like obscure. And it's like, yeah. So, like we even joke about that on mornings. It's like, I'm everywhere. It's Misti morning. And I've also had the pleasure of having a couple of really great email addresses by virtue of the fact that my name is Misti. Like Misty Mountain is like one of my favorite of the email addresses. So yeah, thank you. And it's interesting also, my brother has a very traditional name. I have a somewhat, kind of maybe in time and space, very temporal name. And my sister has an unusual name. My mom named her Krisha. Not Krishna, but Krisha, and I don't think I've ever met another one. So it's kind of interesting.
I wonder if you could say something about doubt,
About doubt.
because a lot of people who come to a spiritual path, they have a major issue with doubt. One, they doubt the effectiveness of the path. Is this really going to work? Is it going to really, And then oftentimes, even if they become convinced that the path, like they listen to you and they go, oh, path seemed to work. But yet people have a lot of, which even I would say more pernicious, is they have self-doubt.
Self-doubt.
Yeah, this is a great path of healing and transformation, but, not for me. I'm too wounded. My mind's too out of control. You know what I mean? So there's lots of doubt, and it sounded like, one of those major things that you internalize with a lot of just doubt about your own capability, your own ability to be different. You just sounded like your way was just to stuff it down and reinvent a new Misti
Yeah, right.
for the public.
Yeah.
Right.
A palatable version. Yeah.
Right, and keep that other part. But I would imagine as you practiced and you began to be more aware of what was going on inside you through practice and meditation, that you sort of began to get in touch with these, more painful, doubting places with yourself. So I'm just wondering whether you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Doubt definitely has played a large role in my path. From early on, kind of questioning myself, looking at my family of origin, everything from like early on, I think the first day of middle school, my mom sat me down and did my hair and makeup and said, this is how you'll look when you leave the house. Like, oh, fundamentally there is something very wrong with me if I have to do this whole charade to leave the house, right? So I've worked with that a lot, like doubting that even who I am is something that other people would want to be around. So that was kind of a big piece of it. But, kind of like the same theme, there was another part of me that was really fierce and strong and a little like, I can do anything I want to do. So I had those two kind of opposing forces in me at work. Definitely doubt about my ability to be in a healthy relationship, friendships, or, romantic relationships, because I had so much anger. And maybe you've experienced this too, where when you internalize something and kind of press it down, like putting that much pressure on it makes it feel a lot bigger and a lot worse than it actually is once you're able to bring it to the light of day. And so for a long time, I was like, oh my goodness, nobody is going to want to be around me if they just knew what was happening in there. So a lot of doubt about my capacity to, be with people if they really knew who I was, which interestingly also made the facade stronger. Right? It made it more important that I be presentable and that, like, that you look at this and say, oh, everything is good, right? So nobody looks too closely at what's happening in there. And then when I started practicing with the Dharma and the teachings and applying them, like, you know, yes, I really experienced some doubt of whether or not I could really transform this, right? Could it? I don't know that I ever really thought, am I so broken I can't do it? I just thought, oh, this is a limitless abyss of whatever, fear and anger. And if I go into it, I don't know that I'll ever come out of it. I remember having a similar feeling when, you know, with grief when my dad died. Like, oh, if I go into that, will I ever get back out of it? But then, for me, what's been so helpful, again, I don't think I can emphasize the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and particularly the Sangha, because I get to practice with people who've been doing this a long time, and I can see them, and I can see what happens with them, and I can see their transformation, and they see something in me and encourage that. And so then it helped me have faith in my ability to kind of counteract the doubt that I could do it and that I can do it. And so much this is not a one and done. This is like a 1 million and keep going, right? Like, it comes up, I have to look at it, and every time it gets a little easier and every time it gets a little less intense. So that's been my antidote to doubt.
Are there more? I have this. Are there more questions or? Yeah, so here and back there, and also online.
Fred, I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I thought you were taking it from me. Oh.
Here, there, and right behind me.
We're kind of like a family around here. He just pats my leg and says, I'm sorry. Sweet. Anyway, we're the same age. So sometimes when I was a kid, I don't know about you, I looked around, especially when I was at Grandma's house, and she sent me to the, she called it inappropriately a word for Japanese, but she sent me to the mini mart to buy her cigarettes for her. And I was like 8, your age, right? And sometimes you look around and you see it's about the times too, because they all had cigarettes. Not that, nothing against people that smoke, but they all had cigarettes hanging out of their mouth and beers cracked open, and they were gambling, and they were playing poker, and it was just like, wow, the times were just rough around the edges, And even as a kid, I don't know, what did you think about that? I looked around and said, man, this is a rough crowd. So did you ever have time? It was a little comical for me too, because I was choking on smoke. The kids would have to go outside just to breathe. Right. And so, what's your reflection about that?
I definitely think that part of my culture where I grew up, that was definitely true. We were like, farmers and ranchers, and, there was drinking and smoking and, like all of that. But I didn't have to go very far. Well, okay, it is still pretty far. From where I grew up to Houston was like an 11-hour drive. So it's like a whole other state away. But, going to Houston, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that at all. Right? Nobody was smoking and nobody was gambling or drinking, and they, sat down to dinner at the table together, and it was like, so I would say it just depended on where I was, right? And even, honestly, even in, my friend groups, so like in small areas where I grew up, there were people who weren't, farmers and ranchers, and, going to their house was a different experience, right? So it wasn't everybody, but it was definitely around me a lot. And yes, there was a lot of, Dad, please roll down the window, because we're in the backseat of the car. But, I don't know that I can say it was so ubiquitous, right? That it was so universal. It seemed very cultural, I guess I would say.
Misty, I've always appreciated that, to me, you really are such an example of living a Dharma life and just your kindness. And, you know, you're very, you work it, you know, you're not claiming to be anything. You come from a past of causes and conditions like we all do, and you work with it. And one of the things I'm really working on, and you expressed really well, is that you, you know, you understand with your family that if they knew better, they would do better, and that kind of thing. And so one of the things I am working on is, like, I know these things logically, but I don't, you know, not so much with my family, but other things out in the world. You know, to me, understanding that if they knew better, they would do better, like, to me, that implies that they're trying, you know, and they're not. And I was just curious about your process of coming to that, you know, with your family or maybe in life, or just, you know, how that works for you.
Yeah, thank you. One really powerful practice was sitting with, like in my formal practice, sitting with my mom when she was 4 years old. I don't really know what my mom's life was like when she was 4, but I can imagine it. And so I did, and because I knew her mom and her dad and her siblings. And so, like, imagining her and how she felt and how that has, you know, carried forward into the person that she is, but sitting with that little person and practicing with her and offering her loving kindness. And the same thing with my dad, you know, and his, you know, bazillions of siblings and poverty, and, you know, it would, you know, like, his dad was really absent. And so it's like practicing with that, really feeling it. So for me, it's not just like knowing it, but like personalizing it for these people, feeling it, having like 3-year-old Karen sit on my lap, or 3-year-old Roy sit on my lap while I'm practicing. And so I've done that too for other people that I feel like I'm like in an alien landscape. I don't understand. It's like, how can I get to understanding, right? Like, what was it like to be these people? What was it like to be them growing up? What happened? And what do I have to offer them that can help me and can help them? So that was one of my practices that was really, really powerful.
And so that's, what do you have to offer to help them? That's helpful for immediate, where you can have an effect, but what about for things that are further away that maybe you don't feel like you can have?
Well, I feel like that is the effect I can have,
Okay.
right? Because
It's
it
just
changes me,
okay.
and it changes my outlook.
Yeah.
And so then it also changes my willingness to be with people different than me, right? So I would say there is an immediate effect, but that immediate effect continues to ripple outward. So it just, you know, it changes my orientation, so it's not so much a us and them sort of thing, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah.
I'm told that, and yet.
What I said, a million and then again, right?
It'll sink in eventually. It really will.
I have no doubt.
Thank you.
Anybody else, either in the hall or online, wants to ask something or share something?
We have a question online, Dee Dee?
Yes. Could you address self-doubt a little bit more? Susan mentioned self-doubt is a major fear of mine as a newcomer to the path of nearly 80 years old.
Yeah. So for me, when I come up against self-doubt, I then start investigating, where is that coming from, right? What is it that is generating the doubt in myself? Is it that I feel like the emotion is too big, or is there some piece of me that's broken? And then one of my favorite teachings is it true? Is that true, right? Am I really broken? No, I don't think so. Am I really, is this really so big I can't handle it? Well, if it was so big I couldn't handle it, how could I have shoved it down for all of that time? So for me, really looking into what is leading to the doubt and examining that compassionately, that's been, a big one for me, is to not, sort of leap to using negative self-talk to address my doubt, but really to compassionately say, look at the people around you that have done this, look at what you're dealing with, and question those beliefs that you put in place, right? A lot of the mechanisms that I used, I feel like were useful at the time, but I've outgrown them. And so then I have to question them and see if they're still useful. And so that's what I would offer for, like, kind of regardless of how old you are, right? To look at it and say, what is leading me to feel like I can't do this, or I'm not worthy of this, and to really examine if that's true.
Hello, Misty. I was curious to hear more about your interactions with your siblings, and how your practice and your growth and evolution, coming from the same background, how I'm imagining, and maybe this is too forward, or, but you probably saw your brother suffering, or, you saw your change versus their stagnation, and you probably wanted to prompt them for growth just like you had, because you saw the benefit. And I'm curious to know how hard you pursued that for each of your siblings, and when you gave up.
Thank you. What is your name?
Jeff.
Jeff, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, the conversation around my siblings, I didn't go too much into depth with them. For a really long time, my brother was a big, scary monster. He was unstable, he was on drugs, he was, just a miserable person who projected his miserableness out into the world violently. And he wasn't safe. So anything I did around him was from a distance. I even have a little mantra, from a safe and protected distance. But I practice for him. I want him to be healthy. I want him to be well. I want him to be peaceful. And he has slowly transformed his life a bit. He's married and seems stable. He's had a job for the same job for a while. I don't think he's using drugs right now. And he and I have, because I'm the caretaker for our mom, I am choosing to engage with him about her care. So I'll reach out, I'll text, or I'll call. He and his wife have been to our house. There was a while where I didn't feel safe to have him near my children when my children were young. So he, wasn't invited to my home. But, they've been, and so just to share how I have no idea if my practice for him is making a difference, but I choose to think it does, because it just puts out positivity into a fairly toxic situation. And at one point, in the early kind of stages of caring for my mom's dementia and Alzheimer's, he wrote and he texted just a line and said, "I was really, really crappy to you when we were kids, and I am so sorry." That is so huge for me. Like, I'm maybe not going to have him over for dinner every week. I mean, he's in Texas, so that'd be impossible. But, he and I are still ideologically very, very different. But that softening has happened. And he is a different person. And so now I have to believe, I have to not doubt, I have to have faith that he also is changing and transforming in his own way and time. And that my harboring ill will or my harboring fear doesn't serve him or me. And so I practice for him. My sister, I've had a very long, involved process with her. She has mental illness. My husband and I took in her youngest child and raised her daughter for 5 years. So we had some interaction when she was she was homeless when she had my niece. Her older child is a ward of the state, as I mentioned. So she's got a lot of suffering still in her life, a lot of, kind of bad men in and out of her life, bad relationships. And, so we stepped in and took my niece in and raised her for several years. And, I challenged her to grow and transform in order to be a mother to her child. Not saying this is how you have to do it, but to say you have to be clean, right? You have to be in therapy. You have to, you have to do these things so that your daughter will not be in danger. And she did it. She did it. She changed herself. Now, the situation, is it ideal? Is it like the way I would want to raise my kids? No, it's not how I raised my kids. But I feel like my role for her is to be there for her, to help her grow and transform too. She's less interested. She's very, I think her mental illness gets in the way quite a lot, But my niece is going to be 16 in December. And so, she's kind of made it almost to adulthood, and I believe we played a significant role in that, and also in providing the impetus for my sister to do things a little bit differently. So I haven't ever given up, I guess is the bottom line, but I also want to make sure that I'm not imposing my will on anybody, and that I can practice for people without them ever knowing. And that sometimes leads to transformation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, just speaking for everybody, it's been wonderful, to hear your, not only your mind seeking the way, and just giving a lot of inspiration for healing, transformation, waking up, no matter what the causes from our past are, that, the practice gives us the freedom to become a Buddha, right? No matter even if how we grew up in the most opposite way, where the seeds of Buddhahood and awakening were never nurtured. And yet you show that by very consciously watering them yourself, but then finding situations and people and communities that help that nurturing of those seeds, even when you're not ready to, is also, very important. Yeah, and sharing your wisdom and your insight. Yeah, thank you very much on behalf of everybody. Before we do the final bows, I just have a quick survey question. So, 2 weeks ago, last week? When was the hurricane? Oof. Does everybody have a little problem with time? So last Sunday we met. We didn't have power, but we didn't have internet. So we met earlier. We met at 9 instead of 10, right? Those who were here, and a bunch of people showed up, and I thought to myself, wow, maybe we should always start at 9 because maybe 10 is actually a little inconvenient for people. So I took a survey of everybody there, and maybe there were 35, I forget, 35? Anyhow, and pretty much everybody said, no, this is great, But I realized it was a biased sample because everybody who was there are the ones who we got here at 9. So this is a more balanced. So how many people, if Sangha was at 9 and then we ended by 11, would be okay with that? Okay.
As opposed to prefer it.
Yeah, prefer. Yeah. I mean, we all have our preference. It's just okay. How many people it would be a deal breaker? But what?
Looking for a fair sample. The way that
So,
you ask the question makes all the difference.
well, all right. How would you ask the question?
Just say who prefers 9, who prefers 10.
She's a strong woman. Who prefers 9? Who prefers 10? So it seems, I don't know, was that 50-50 or 60-40? What did that seem like? It may be 60-40, so... Yeah. And how many people would show up at 9 or 10? There you go. All right. Thank you, strong women, for helping me through this.